came to be. So the story begins with Tom Whigham. Tommy Whigham was the most heavily recruited high school football player from the state of Florida. He was the quarterback of the Sanford High School team that won the state championship. And he could have gone to any college, Michigan, Penn State, you name it, he could have gone, but he elected to go to the University of Florida. And while at the University of Florida, he developed ulcerative colitis. So he never got to play football for the University of Florida. He was just too ill to play for them. And while he was there, he decided he'd pursue a career in law, and he became a very successful lawyer ultimately. But he developed a bout of hemorrhagic colitis in 1983. And it was at a time that, although we had recognized that HIV was a virus, we didn't really have any testing for it. So how did we test the blood? We asked if people engaged in risky behaviors when the blood was given. And he said, look, I call my family. He had a large family in Dothan, Alabama. And he said, I'm going to call my family members and have them come and give me blood. I need blood. They said, don't worry about it. We test the blood. Well, it turned out that they didn't test the blood that well. And he didn't know it. He became very ill initially. He recovered from that. He got married. He had children. And after the birth of his second child, having moved back to Sanford, as a successful attorney in a very large law firm and having big cases, his wife was called, and the obstetrician called the wife and said, you know, Sally, I've given you Rogam because she was Rh negative. I'm concerned that we might have passed HIV to you through Rogam. You should come in and be tested. He said, oh, I got all that blood. I should get tested too. So she gets tested. She's negative. He gets tested. It turns out he's positive. Now, this is at the time that HIV had this incredible stigma associated with it. Those of us from Florida remember the Ray boys were having their home burned down, the hemophiliac boys. They didn't want them in the community. So he was very reluctant to tell anybody, and he did a lot of pro bono work for HIV at the time. And there was no treatment for HIV either. And several years later, he started losing the ability to speak. He had word-finding difficulties, and he ended up at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville. And they weren't sure what was going on. They recognized that there was some sort of brain disease. At that time, I had probably the largest population of neurologic complications with HIV-infected people of anybody anywhere in the world here at Jackson Memorial Hospital. So they called me up and said, would you take him as a patient? I said, of course I take him as a patient. So he comes down. We established a diagnosis. He had an illness called progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. We had no treatment for it, and we sent him back to Sanford, where he moved into his parents' house. He admitted to his neighbors that he was HIV infected. They embraced him. People would come over and help care for him. A number of months later, he actually developed severe back pain. They took him back to Jacksonville. They said, oh, it's musculoskeletal pain. His sister, who was a radiology technician, called me and said, what are we going to do with Tommy? And I said, get him in an air ambulance, bring him down here, we'll see what we can do. And it turned out, at that time, he had another complication, which was lymphoma that was studying his nerve roots. And he actually didn't die from the PML, he died from the lymphoma. That was very sad. I get a phone call from his wife, Sally. I become incredibly friendly with his family and with him. And his wife said, Joe, you need to come to Tommy's funeral. I said, Sally, I don't go to people's funerals. She said, no, Tommy would have insisted that you come to the funeral. So I said, well, when is it? And it turned out to be on a day that it was a clinic day, but I wasn't seeing anybody from South or Central America or Germany, because I'd have patients fly in from all over, and I didn't want to disappoint them. So I canceled the patients, I flew up, and the time she gave me was the wrong time. I was going to be late if I drove from the Orlando airport to the place in Sanford but it turns out that Tommy's best friend was the chief of police of Sanford, Florida, and he met me at the airport in a helicopter, and he helicoptered me to Sanford, Florida, and police escort to the Baptist church. And it was standing room only outside the church. And I'm thinking, wow, this is crazy. And they ushered me to the front pew, sitting amongst the family. And I said, I thought you guys were Methodists. And they said, yeah, we are Methodists. I said, well, why is this in a Baptist church? They said, it's the biggest church in town. Did you see? It's standing room only out there. Senior law partner, a guy named Ken McIntosh, at least 3 times during the eulogy. I didn't do very much for Tom. I mean, I had no treatments for him. And we had this 100 and more car funeral procession at every corner. This is the South. This is not like Miami. The broad brim police officers with their hats on their heart at every single corner that we passed to the cemetery. And I get to the grave site, and I'm standing next to his oldest sister, Karen Coleman. Karen was the superintendent of schools for Seminole County. And in a thick Southern accent, she said, Joe, what can we do for AIDS? And I had 2 very good mentors here at the University of Miami. One was a guy named Perch Scheinberg, who was the chairman of the Department of Neurology, fantastic person and great mentor, who taught me about raising money after I made a mistake with a guy named Larimer Mellon, who was a patient of mine. And I asked him once for $10,000. He said, why don't you ask him for $10 million? He took out his checkbook and he wrote a check for $10,000. I was so excited. I was a young guy, But that's another story. The development office at the University of Miami was very upset with me, I can tell you that. But the other was a guy named Ed Norton. So Ed was the chair of ophthalmology and was married to Mrs. Breyer. You see the Breyers patch out there by basketball. And these guys were great at raising money. They were just terrific at it. And I said, Karen, you can give money for books. You can give money for labs and microscope. You can give money for a building. But if you want Tom's name to live in perpetuity, endow a chair. And she said, well, what does that cost? And I don't remember what the cost was at the University of Miami at that time. It's probably 3 times that now, but like every other university. But I mentioned, well, it's in excess of $1 million. She said, we're people of very modest means. It was a big family, but they weren't people of modest means. Said, I'll be in touch. Well, 2 weeks later, I get a phone call. Can you come back to Sanford? Sally Smith is having a meeting, and she needs you there. Who is Sally Smith? She's the mayor of Sanford. So there was a town meeting. And I flew up to Sanford, and at this town meeting, Sally Smith and Ken McIntosh, Tommy's senior law partner, said, the city of Sanford is going to help the Whigham family establish this chair. Well, that's fantastic. I said, I'm so delighted. There was a voice in the back, J.B. Whigham. J.B. Whigham was Tom Whigham's father. He was a salty Alabaman, thick accent. And he said, I want the chair to be named the Whigham Berger Chair. I said, well, I want to sit in the chair. I don't know. It should be named after me. He said, no, I insist your names be linked inextricably. So I said, okay, whatever you guys want to do is fine with me. And they started raising money. How did they raise money? It wasn't like some big family contribution. They'd go to churches. They'd go to churches and they'd talk at the end of the sermon. They'd talk about HIV, AIDS, and their brother and how their brother died and how we had to do something for it. People would scurry out with rats, they told me, like rats. But there'd always be one family that stuck around. One family, every church, 1 or 2 families. And there were small amounts of contribution. Now, at that point in time, I had this practice here at the University of Miami that had a lot of people in the arts community, huge number of people in the arts community because of the HIV story. And one of the people in that arts community, who wasn't actually from Miami, he was from Amsterdam, was the art representative for Andy Warhol, David Hockney, and Keith Haring, the Radiant Babies. And he had been seen by neurologists who did HIV in a number of places who couldn't help him. He had a problem with his muscles. And I said, I'm going to try something nobody would dare do. I'm going to put you on steroids. I know you're immunosuppressed, but I'm going to put you on stage. Let me tell you something. 30 years later, 2 years ago, I'm sitting at my desk at the University of Pennsylvania. He called me from Germany. He said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Of course I remember you." He said, "Not only am I alive, I'm doing great. I'm still selling art and I'm still working," and so on and so forth. So in any event, he, because he was connected to David Hockney, and Keith Haring had just died of HIV, and David was the executor of his estate, he said, well, I'm going to convince David to give a check. So one of the biggest checks actually came from David Hockney through Keith Haring's estate, or from Keith Haring's estate. And then at the same time, there was contributions from the bar, because Tommy, after all, was a lawyer. So the attorneys were providing sums of money. So it was dribbling and drabbling in. And then the family, the Whigham family, went to Tallahassee. And they spoke to a guy named Bud Gardner. Bud Gardner was responsible for the distribution of money from the state of Florida. He was in Congress. He represented Sanford, and they knew him. Sanford's a small town. And Bud said to him as they walked in the office, he said, "I'm not giving any money. I'm not giving you any money." They said, "Bud, let me tell you the story about our brother, Tommy." When they finished the story, they tell me tears were rolling down Bud's face. He said, "All right, whatever you need, whatever you need." The state of Florida came up with $500,000. Now this story, and then Bernie Fogel was the dean at the time, and Bernie came up with whatever money he had to make the chair whole. So this is not the work of just one person. This was an effort by a lot of people to fund this. And that's how this chair came to be. It's a remarkable story, such a remarkable story that it was written up in the New York Times by Curry Grusin, who was a patient of mine here in Miami. She's a writer for the New York Times. Her mother was Flora Lewis, who was the European chief correspondent for the New York Times. Her father was David Grusin, who was the New York Times editor at the time. And Curry said, "I've got to write this story up." And we traveled up to Sanford a few times. She wrote it up. It was in the Orlando Sentinel. It was in the Miami Herald. It was in, of course, the local Sanford paper, the name of which I can't recall. It was remarkable how it came to be. And it's very flattering that they put my name on it. I will tell you one other story because this is it's just such a great story. I went to visit J.B. and Millie Whigham at their house. I actually been to their house a few times. These are Tommy's parents. This is where Tommy lived when he was in the last months of his life. J.B. Whigham was the most heavily decorated war hero from World War II, from Alabama. And he had a little room, maybe about the size of that area that we had those drinks in, where he had Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Hearts, and newspaper clippings of what J.B. Whigham had done during World War II. One of the clippings had local boy, machine guns, 50 Nazis. That was the heading. You know, it's World War II. And J.B. Whigham, as he's taking me around his room, showing me all his medals and all the papers, he puts his arm around me and he goes, "Joe, I want you to know, this is what I did for the Jews during the war." What the hell do you say to that? I said, "Thanks, J.B." It's a crazy story. Anyhow, and I'm delighted to be back. Jose, thanks for the invitation. Dean, thank you for having me. And Flavia, it's great that you now sit in the chair.